Thank you very much. I would like to thank colleagues from across this House for their expressions of support for this private member's bill, and to the Cabinet and all members of the Cabinet for this week agreeing to support this bill. I'd also like to thank both ministers for being with us here this evening, and I'd like to thank Solicitor and Dublin Midwest constituent William Aylmer for his assistance in drafting this bill. I'm delighted he could be here today, and so many of my campaign team could be here with me today, given that they helped get me here. I engaged very closely with the National Women's Council of Ireland to formulate this bill, and I am delighted to have their support and their backing on this really important issue. I'll begin by explaining the contents of the bill itself. The Corporate Governance Gender Balance Bill will make provision for the regulation of gender balance on the boards and governing authorities of corporate bodies and related matters. In doing so, it will provide for gender quotas to be introduced at boardroom level. It will require all companies, as set out in the bill, to have 33% of each gender on their boards within a year of commencement of the Act. It will require them to have 40% within 3 years of commencement of the legislation. And this 3-year lead-in period has been included in order to take account of the typical life cycle of a corporate board, and will mean that once the legislation is enacted, companies can begin planning ahead for the next incarnation of their board with gender balance in mind. However, I do think it's important to note that boards don't have to wait until this legislation is enacted to start improving their gender representation in their organisation. They can do that now. And I'd love to see companies, spurred on by this debate today, starting to address the imbalances around their boardroom tables now, and not waiting to be compelled to do so by law. This bill will compel companies, as set out in the Companies Act 2014, to submit an annual report to the Companies Registration Office on the gender balance within their boardrooms. Doing this will enable us to have access to the data on which executive boards are meeting or passing the benchmarks set for them and where people are falling short. The legislation is built on a comply or explain model to ensure that where companies do not meet the set-out gender quotas, that they do have the opportunity to explain the shortcoming before any sanctions are applied. There are groups which will be exempt from the legislation, and these include unincorporated associations, partnerships, limited liability partnerships and single director companies, and it will also not apply to micro companies as defined in the 2014 Act, or other corporate bodies with an annual turnover of less than 750,000 or which employ fewer than 20 employees, or indeed both. This bill is not seeking to punish or to burden small businesses. It is not seeking to impinge or dampen entrepreneurship. Rather, it seeks to hold larger corporations accountable to a standard of representation within their organisation. The 33% and the 40% gender quotas will be mandatory. But as I've said, they will be built on a comply and explain mechanism. So this means that companies that do not meet the gender quotas will have the opportunity to explain why they couldn't meet them before any action is taken to compel compliance. The law will include a statutory right that will allow any interested party to apply to the High Court for an order to compel compliance where companies' explanation for non-compliance is deficient. And I think this is a really important part of the bill because it will ensure that the legislation has teeth. We have seen for many years that soft targets around gender representation simply don't bring about the change we need in the time we want to see it in. Quotas are somewhat of a blunt instrument, and I do recognise that. And ideally, we wouldn't need them, but we do. Quotas are proven to work, and when they are backed by mandatory compliance, they are strengthened even further. All companies can also apply for a certificate of compliance from the Company Registration Office. And it's my ambition that this certificate will serve as a mark of excellence and representation to show them that complying is what they do. And that's what's going to help them attract and retain talent. And it will showcase the companies that lead on the issue of gender balance. It will do this in tandem with the gender pay gap legislation. The bill will clearly highlight the organisations who are leading on gender representation. And so I hope, Cathaoirleach, that this bill will pave the way for balanced representation of both men and women in leadership roles in businesses through quotas. Boardroom gender quotas have been successfully implemented in a number of European countries. They are advocated for at EU level and were a recommendation of Ireland's Citizens' Assembly on Gender Equality earlier this year. And a recent report by the National Women's Council of Ireland sets out the impact they could have in Ireland. Currently, we use soft targets to measure and drive the representation of women in boardrooms and state organisations. And that's a really welcome start, and I commend the work done by bodies such as Balance for Better Business and the 30% Club. But gender balance in our boardrooms, unfortunately, is not improving quick enough. On state boards, change without a quota has been painfully slow. Great progress has been made on state boards, where women now represent 41% of directors, but it took 25 years to meet that target, introduced in 1993. Only 19 of 39 listed boards in Ireland have met the 2022 targets of 30% female representation for the ISEC 20 and 22% for other listed companies. ISEC 20 companies now have an average female representation of 32% at board level. That is just such welcome progress. However, the boards of other listed companies outside of these have an average of only 23% female representation. In fact, 13% of all Irish companies have no female board member whatsoever. So while targets are improving the situation, they're not doing enough, and they're not doing enough quick enough. The case for legislative gender quotas on boards is made all the more convincing when we look at the international experience. Countries like Norway, which was the first country in the world to impose gender quotas on boards back in 2006. In doing so, they increased their female representation on boards from 5% in 2001 up to 40% in 2008, within just 2 years of enacting the legislation. And Norway isn't alone. They are top of a growing list of countries favouring gender quotas as a means of boosting gender balance on corporate boards. Countries like Belgium, like France, like Germany, Iceland, India, Israel, Italy, Norway, the UAE, Pakistan and Spain have all seen the benefits of quotas. And I think it's time that Ireland follows the example of so many of our European neighbours by introducing gender quotas in our boardrooms. Due to the severe economic strain suffered by many companies during the pandemic, gender equality measures may fall down the agenda of governments and of company boards, especially since across the EU, women make up only 34% of board members and 9% of chairs. And analysts would say that this would be a mistake and that the crisis represents an opportunity for companies to invest in building more flexible, more adaptable and more empathetic workforces. The recent Citizens' Assembly on Gender Equality emphasised that actions were required to confront the slow progress in gender equality in both leadership and in decision-making. And they themselves recommended the enactment of gender quota legislation that requires companies to have at least 40% gender balance on their boards. And in keeping with the recommendations of the Citizens' Assembly, this is exactly what my bill seeks to achieve. During my discussions on this bill, I had multiple meetings and engagements with women in business organisations and interested parties. Groups like Women Inspire, Women in Business, Women Mean Business, the Professional Women's Network, the 30% Club, ICTU, IBEC, SIPTU, Better Balance for Business and the National Women's Council. And while each of these groups had varying opinions on how we go about achieving gender balance in our corporate boardrooms, and some indeed had clashing opinions, they were all united on one thing. They all agree that women need to be better represented in the boardroom. Gender quotas are shown to broaden the talent pool available to employers. They're shown to ensure boards think outside the box when it comes to replacing board members, rather than repeatedly replacing them with people of the exact same profile, replacing men with men. Companies with balanced boardrooms make better decisions. They are shown to perform better financially, and that leads to the trickle-down benefits for women in all levels in all companies. Gender inequality is all around us. It's in many different sectors of work and areas of life. And so I know some people will question why this bill focuses on the corporate world and tackling representation purely in the boardroom. Well, the truth is, there is no one bill that could be both specific enough and broad enough to take on gender inequality in all professions and in all areas of work, of life and in business. But this bill is a start, and it focuses on a substantial chunk of businesses and employers in Ireland and corporate organisations. And I'm a firm believer that change begins at the top. And it is the example and the model set forth by those at decision-making level that influences engagement at the next level. And so that's why I think it's so important to start at the boardroom. The global evidence shows us that after adoption, quotas have influenced not only the number of women on boards, but also the performance and the outcomes of decision-making bodies and broader public attitudes. Quotas redistribute power at the top of the labour market, and that has a positive trickle-down effect for middle management, for recruitment, for improving financial performance. They can also lead to smaller gender wage gaps, more flexible work options, and even better measures to combat sexual harassment. Balanced boards make better business sense. Including women ensures that full use is made of the range of talent available. More diverse perspectives are incorporated, and that leads to greater innovation. It leads to higher productivity and better working conditions for everyone. And these findings are evident in the research from consultants, from banks, from investment research firms, the likes of Deloitte, McKinsey, Catalyst, MCSI. In fact, in 2020, McKinsey & Co., their Diversity Wins report actually found that companies whose boards are in the top quartile of gender diversity are 28% more likely to outperform their peers financially. That research further shows that gender diversity improves private equity and venture capital returns. And so I really believe the research and the international experience all speak for itself. Ireland needs gender quotas at a boardroom level. This bill will create the opportunity for both men and women to be fairly represented at the top table of business. It will ultimately lead to better balance in the boardroom being achieved. And our boardrooms need to be a reflection of our society. We all have a role to play in breaking down the unconscious biases and the reinforced stereotypes that exist in our world. This bill isn't about favouring women over men. Let me be clear about that, Cathaoirleach. It's not about giving people opportunities they haven't earned or aren't qualified for. It is quite the opposite, in fact. I often hear about this bill, well, shouldn't it just be the best person for the best job? And I would absolutely agree with that. Absolutely. If men and women were put on even footing from the beginning. If men and women had equal opportunity to get a place at a boardroom. But they don't. Historical barriers, cultural barriers, sometimes educational barriers, familial barriers have put women's progress in the workplace far behind that of their male counterparts. Women have fought hard to break down those barriers, and we have made massive progress in the last decade. But if we don't intervene, men and women will simply never be on an even footing in the workplace. This bill is about breaking the cycle of replacing like with like. It's about encouraging organisations to think outside the box, think outside the norm when recruiting, to give more women a chance to start putting work in now to ensure we have a better talent pool of board-ready women. I also want to point out that the term female representation is an umbrella term, because within that there's also a need for women of colour, women with disabilities, LGBTQI women, women from lower socioeconomic backgrounds and other marginalised groups. This bill solely deals with the overall representation of women in corporate governance, but I hope in time we will see it expanded on. It is my hope and my ambition that both men and women will have equal opportunity to not just get their foot in the door, but to earn a seat at the boardroom table. I'm grateful to Cathaoirleach for the opportunity to bring this bill before the House, and I'd like to thank you for taking my slot in the chair. And once again, I'd like to thank William Aylmer from the Kevin Jacob Bernard McCormack branch of Fine Gael in Dublin Midwest, the Bill's Office, the Office of Parliamentary Legal Advisers, Fine Gael Women's Network, and I'd also like to thank the National Women's Council of Ireland, who collaborated so closely with me on this bill and who have done so much for female representation in all areas of society, and the cross-party Oireachtas Women's Caucus for indicating cross-party support for this bill.
Good and talk to a nation.